Today on Trek Voyage, we're going to learn about torpedo spread and the diagnostic information behind it. We'll learn about standard full-time torpedoes, we'll learn about quantum torpedoes, and we'll learn about torpedoes themselves, and we'll learn about the different launchers they have and what they can do. Alright, so we'll learn about the standard photon torpedoes seen on the Enterprise, we'll see about the quantum torpedoes seen on the Defiant, and we'll learn about both kinds of weapons, how strong they are, and when they fall on our scale points of damage. Next, we'll learn about torpedoes like the Enterprise A for 65,000, and then we'll see about torpedo technology as it increased, like the Galaxy class, the Enterprise D for 171,000. And then we'll also talk about quantum torpedoes seen like on the Defiant and some of the newer generation ships. Now, there's some interesting facts about quantum torpedoes and the difference between photon torpedoes and quantum torpedoes, and we'll discuss that in this video. Alright, Trek War fans, let's engage. So before we look at our ships, let's look at the different type of torpedoes that we commonly see. So we have the Enterprise A, which uses an Mk-12IF torpedo launcher, capable of launching just one standard torpedo. Then we have ships like the Constitution, which has an Mk-6DF, which is capable of launching 2 to 3 standard torpedoes. Then we have the newer generation, the Mk-22DFs, one-shot torpedo launchers, which you see in TNG, which are typically seen on newer variants of the Excelsior. Now, it's also noted that some of the more advanced ships like the Ambassador were carrying Mk-60 DFs. And our most powerful ships were carrying Mk-80s, but we'll get to them later. So let's look at the typical torpedo barrage we would see. The newer Galaxies were using a more advanced torpedo launcher capable of launching TNG-style torpedoes, which would give them an offensive value of 342,000. Now, older ships that were during the Kirk era were using typically 4 torpedo launchers, but they were using older generation torpedoes for 65,000, and they were also single shots, and there would be around 260,000. Now, the standard Miranda has 2-shot torpedo launcher for 65,000 each, which would equal 130,000. So right off the bat, you can see that there is pretty large technological gap between the TNG Excelsior and then the Kirk Excelsior, even though it has more torpedo tubes. So what you learn right off the bat is just because you have more torpedo tubes doesn't make you better. Now let's take a look at some of the light cruisers. So you have the Constellation. The Constellation is able to launch 6 torpedoes. Those 6 torpedoes are around 65,000 points of damage, which gives it an overall attack value of 390,000. Now you have our same Centaur, which is the same weapon complement that you see pretty much on a newer version or a more modern Excelsior. It's got 2 torpedo launchers. It's going to be able to launch torpedoes of 171,000 points of damage for 342,000. So the really interesting thing is you can see that the older variant of the Constellation is actually better than this newer ship. So the Constellation ship actually has a really powerful reactor. It's got those 4 engines. It's able to produce a lot of power. That's the reason why it's able to power some of these multi-shot torpedo tubes, giving it a large offensive torpedo barrage capabilities, which is far better than most ships of its time period. During its time period, it would have been a torpedo gunboat. Alright, now we're looking at more modern ships that are using the Mk-80. So the Mk-80 is capable of launching 4 standard torpedoes for 684,000, but there's something else it can do. It could also choose to launch 2 quantum torpedoes. So the ship can pick and choose between launching 4 standard or 2 quantums. So the original Mk-80, before added to the Sabre and some of the newer ships like the Akira, it actually was much larger but was able to deliver a much larger payload. It can deliver 10 torpedoes of 171,000 points of damage for 1,710,000. It's also noted that the Akira and the Ambassadors were using Mk-80s during the Dominion War. So the Ambassador classes were modified to carry the same torpedo launcher that you would see on a Galaxy-class starship. That wasn't the type of weapon it originally used, but it could be upgraded because its power core was large enough to accommodate that. And then the Akira had multiple Mk-80 launchers located throughout the entire ship. All right, it's been stated that the Sovereign class could launch 12 quantum torpedoes, though we never saw that on screen. And at 325,000 points of damage, it would be 3,900,000, which is an amazing amount of damage. Now, the standard Ambassador class before the Dominion War typically had 3 single-shot TNG-style torpedo launchers, giving an attack value of 513,000. Now, the Defiant itself could launch 4 quantum torpedoes at 325,000 apiece for 1,300,000, or it could choose to launch 6 standard Photon torpedoes and 1 barrage. All right, so let's take a look at some of the ships of the line and let's see what we can figure out. So one of the things right off the bat is you can tell that for the most part, most of the ships in Starfleet are using about the same ordnance. You know, they're using the 2 standard Photon torpedo tubes, which are single shot, giving them a offensive value of 342,000. Now, when I look at the Constellation, it's a unique ship, and we're going to talk about it just a little bit to explain why it can do what it's do and how it can outgun even newer ships because of its technology. So one of the interesting facts about this ship is it has a newer style warp core, which is more powerful than standard warp cores of ships like the Constitution or the Constellation and the Excelsior. It was able to draw more power and send it to the Mk-6DFs, which are multi-shot. So ships of this time period were using the same single-shot torpedo launchers, but this ship had a multi-shot torpedo launcher. So it was capable of putting enough power to its torpedoes to launch 6 instead of the standard 2. So most of the time, most ships couldn't get more than 1 or 2 shots from a torpedoes. And they were using a standard torpedo shot, which we'll take a look at right now. So the Excelsior and the Constitution class are using single-shot Mk-12IF torpedo launchers. So they're able to launch 1 torpedo per tube. And so this is the standard that you see because it doesn't use a lot of power and it doesn't take a lot of space. And this is the reason why most Federation ships are using this. It's because these other torpedo launchers, they take an enormous amount of power, and the more torpedoes they shoot, the larger the launcher needs to be. So let's take a look at the New Orleans. So if you guys are familiar with the New Orleans, it's like 342 meters long, something along those lines. It's like half the size of a Galaxy as far as length. It's much, much smaller. It's a little tiny ship, but this ship has advanced technology on it, and it has a very powerful warp core. It's the same kind of warp core that we've seen in the Galaxy class. So it's able to generate a lot of power. This is also the same reason why it's using Galaxy class moderate versions, smaller versions of the nacelles. So everything about this ship is actually state-of-the-art when it came out. This is one of the most powerful frigates the Federation had ever deployed. So the Mk-80 launcher on the Galaxy class, you see those things on the bottom of the ship and on the top? Those are torpedo tubes. They're huge. They're absolutely massive. So when they originally created the Mk-80 launcher to launch 10 torpedoes, it was just so big and so bulky, it wasn't really optional for a lot of starships. So it was okay for a Galaxy class. They're able to fit it into the neck of the ship because the ship is so long. Same thing with the Nebula. So, but what they quickly ran into is that more medium class ships like, let's say, the Sabre or Excelsiors, none of those things would ever be able to take something like this. And the more modern ships like the Sabre and even the Akira, they decided they wanted a smaller launcher, but they wanted to have still be able to launch multiple torpedoes. And so there is an Mk-80 variant which we see, and we'll kind of take a look at that right now. So Sabres and Akiras are using an Mk-80 torpedo launcher, which is a newer version, but it's a much smaller, more compact version. So it can only launch 4 instead of the 10. But it's much smaller space, and it's more space friendly for the starship. So that's why the Federation went ahead and pretty much uses those versions of the MK-80. It's a smaller variant, but it can still launch quantum torpedoes. Now, the ratio from standard torpedoes to quantum torpedo is, if you have a torpedo launcher like the Sabre, you have one torpedo launcher in the front, you can launch 4 standard torpedoes, or you can launch 2 quantums. So let's kind of take a look at this. So why would you want to do that? Because obviously, 3 standard torpedoes is around 513 points of damage when a quantum torpedo is 325. So why would you want to do that? Well, the only reason for that is quantum torpedoes are different. The way they hit a ship, they cause much more damage and much more bleed through from the shields to the ship. So you could launch, let's say, 3 torpedoes at a really well-armored ship, like, let's say, Galaxy. You're not going to bring down its shields. You're going to bring maybe a third of its shields down by launching 3 torpedoes. Now, if you hit it with 1 quantum torpedo, you'll actually have bleed through, which actually could cause ship failure or damage to the starship.
Quantum torpedoes, full spread.
Torpedoes locked on target.
Fire.
Their defense systems are offline, and they've lost main power.
Tom, 3 more.
Okay, so this is the reason why I would say you have a Miranda. Why would you just not put an MK-80 launcher on a Miranda and have it shoot 10 torpedoes? That seems like a really great idea. Well, in theory, yes. But unfortunately, if you were to do that, the most the ship could do is still launch 2 torpedoes. And that's why they don't bother doing this kind of thing, because it's useless. The ship doesn't have enough power to run that weapon that way. You have to have a newer ship with a newer power core to do that. And so that's why you see a lot of single shots torpedo launchers on Federation starships, is because they don't take a lot of power. You can still get a good amount of damage, and you don't have to have a ridiculous power core to run it. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the launchers, and now we know why ships are able to launch torpedoes and have the torpedo barrages, let's kind of look at the ships and what they were doing and how good they are. So right off the bat, even to this day, a Constellation is still delivering a good amount of firepower, even if it's using old torpedoes, and that's a really good torpedo boat for a ship as old as it is. And then you can see that the Sabres are extremely good ships. I mean, that MK-80 is fantastic. A ship that's fast, maneuverable, that can do a lot of damage. And then obviously the Sovereign is an absolute beast. And when you look at the Ambassador, it's for a ship as old as it is, it's doing a lot of damage. And then obviously the Defiant is bringing an incredible amount of damage. And then we look at all the ships that have the MK-80s. We're talking about the New Orleans, the Nebulas, the Galaxies, the Advanced Ambassadors, and then the Akiras. Those guys are your torpedo freaks. Those are the guys that are blowing everything away from far range. And then you can see our standard ships, the Excelsior, the newer Excelsiors with the more modern launchers, are still delivering a lot of damage. So you think about, a lot of ships are still using older torpedo technology, like the 65,000. And so you could have, far less torpedo tubes and still deliver a lot of power and damage based on the ordnance they're using. And so that's really interesting. When I watched this, when I figured all this out, I could really see how the Excelsior, like when I read the manual and talk about the Excelsior having only 2 torpedo tubes, and I was like, it didn't really visually mean a whole lot to me until I saw these numbers together. And I went, you know what? Okay, they're using new launchers, and they don't need to have tons of torpedo tubes, because they're getting, more power out of those 2 more advanced tubes than they would by just putting a bunch of cheaper tubes on. And so it's kind of cool. It was something I realized. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you guys learned something about how technology works with photon torpedoes, quantum torpedoes, and how there's all these factors that you have to take in consideration to figure out how powerful the ship is. Number 1, what kind of torpedo tubes does it have? What kind of torpedoes is it using? And then obviously the most important factor is, what kind of warp core does it have? Does it have enough power to power the tubes that you gave it? With that being said, I hope you guys all have a wonderful weekend. Peace out.